Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. There has been an increasing focus on shock-responsive and adaptive social protection in recent years, particularly driven by more frequent weather events and climate-related disasters. But the role of social protection in conflict and protracted crisis has received less attention. These are some of the most difficult contexts where conflict, displacement, poverty, and climate impacts often intersect. In the era of the polycrisis, there is an urgent need to better understand how social protection can be better deployed, where shocks are ongoing and complex. So today, we're kicking off a 3-part series on social protection in conflict and protracted crisis, produced in partnership with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. And in this first episode, we're talking about women and other vulnerable groups in crisis settings. How can social protection help to mitigate impacts on the most vulnerable people? And how can social protection schemes be more gender responsive and gender sensitive in conflict settings? We'll be looking closely at the impacts of Lebanon's multifaceted socio-economic crisis and at how to sustain and build social protection systems in these most difficult of contexts. With me for the episode today, we have Rachel Sabates-Wheeler, who is Professorial Research Fellow and a Director of the Centre for Social Protection at the Institute of Development Studies. She is also co-director of the Better Assistance in Crises research program that goes by the name of BASIC, funded by the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK. And Rima Al-Muqdad, Technical Specialist on Social Protection and Data and Research at UN Women in Lebanon. Welcome to the podcast, Rachel and Rima.
Thank you. It's really great to be here.
Thank you so much for having me here today, Jo.
Rachel, with this episode, we're kicking off a 3-part series on social protection in situations of conflict and protracted crisis. And on this show, we've devoted many episodes to shock-responsive and adaptive social protection, especially where the shocks have come from the COVID pandemic, disasters, climate change. But we have had less focus on contexts where that shock is caused or exacerbated or mixed up in conflict, or where that crisis is protracted and ongoing. So to start off, can you tell us a bit about the global picture of conflict and protracted crisis, and what are the intersecting drivers or dimensions that come together to create that fragility and create that environment?
To recap for people listening, shock responsive social protection is around the ability of systems to be nimble, to scale up, to scale out in the event of a shock. And so while it's a really important agenda, it actually primarily applies in settings where there is a social protection system to respond and scale up. And it's actually also being developed in relation very much to climate events and droughts and seasonality. So there's been a lot of conflict, blindness and fragility blindness around shock response social protection. And that's crazy when you think about it, because we know from World Bank statistics that by 2030, more than half the world's extreme poor are going to be in countries characterized by fragility, conflict, violence. We also know that we've got ongoing new conflicts that are causing record numbers of displaced people to flee their homes. And just a statistic, as of mid-2023, 110 million people were displaced by persecution, violence, and human rights violations. So there's a huge amount of unrest, as we all know, across the world in various pockets. We're living in a time of interconnected, overlapping, compounding crises. In fact, one of my PhD students, Megan Devenald, she talks about crises as being these events that evolve into or intersect with chronic states of ill-being, and they disrupt communities and they just make life very unstable. Something that myself and colleagues, we put out a recent IDS bulletin on issues to do with humanitarian aid and fragility and social protection. And we draw on the OECD framework for fragility. And they have all these different intersecting dimensions of fragility. And those dimensions include like violence, political instability, climate, displacement, and they all kind of overlap together to give us this sense that we're in a kind of new space. where we have all these sort of intersecting complex vulnerabilities. So I think that gives you a sense of what kind of terrain we're looking at when we think about fragility and conflict.
Thank you, Rachel. Rima, Lebanon, where you are, has experienced a multifaceted socio-economic crisis since at least 2019, resulting in increased rates of poverty amongst the population and a range of other effects. Can you give us a sense of what this polycrisis or this multifaceted crisis looks like in Lebanon?
Well, Joe, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in context what Rachel says basically to the context of Lebanon. So I was recently interviewing a civil society representative, and during the conversations, she said that the only constant in Lebanon is crises, and this truly hit home for me. So starting in late 2019, basically Lebanon plunged into a multidimensional financial and economic crisis, which the World Bank ranked in the top 10, possibly top 3 of the most severe economic crisis globally since the mid-1800s. The crisis was induced by a halt in capital inflows, a banking sector crisis, and a currency crash, further compounded by disruptions caused by COVID-19 and the Beirut port explosion. And as a result, the economy contracted alongside a dramatic depreciation of the value of the Lebanese pound and a triple-digit inflation. And this naturally meant that poverty increased sharply. The most recent report by the World Bank reveals a significant increase in monetary poverty from 12% in 2012 to 44% in 2022. Also, it is estimated that at least 1.2 million people are living below the extreme poverty line now. And here I want to also point out that since the onset of the Syrian conflict in 2011, Lebanon has hosted around 1.5 million Syrian refugees, constituting about 27% of the country's estimated population, which is huge. And according to the latest figures by UNHCR, 9 out of 10 refugee households in Lebanon live in extreme poverty. Also, this escalating poverty levels and competition for resources always risks exacerbating intercommunal tensions and shrinking the refugee protection space. And as I said earlier, in 2020, we had the Beirut port explosion, which had devastating impacts on the capital city. It claimed the lives of over 200 people, injured more than 7,000, and displaced approximately 300,000 residents. The explosion also caused severe damage in Beirut's infrastructure and disrupted essential services across the city. And this event alone overwhelmed emergency response capacities. And I think the last event that I want to shed light on, which is the most recent one, has been the war on Lebanon, which escalated dramatically on the 23rd of September last year. So Lebanon has been enduring basically its most severe crisis since the 2006 war. The war has claimed the lives of over 4,000 individuals. This war actually led to massive displacement, with nearly 900,000 people being forced to leave their homes. Of these 900,000, 80,000 are Syrian refugees, and around 3,400 were Palestinian refugees who are residing in Lebanon. And although now a ceasefire was agreed upon on the 27th of November last year, daily violations persist, and this complicates the situation. The scale of the destruction and the ongoing instability means that critical humanitarian needs will continue to unfold alongside urgent recovery and reconstruction efforts.
Thank you. And it really does paint a really stark picture of just the level of complexity and the number of intersecting factors that are contributing to the situation in Lebanon. To stay with you, Rima, and I guess coming to the theme for this episode, how do we see women and children as well, particularly being affected by this intersecting crisis in Lebanon?
The polycrisis, and specifically here, the economic crisis, we can clearly see how it magnified pre-existing vulnerabilities that women in Lebanon already faced across many dimensions. So Lebanese women's labor force participation, which was already far lower than men's participation before the crisis, fell even further from around 27% in 2018 to around 23% in 2022. In addition to increased job informality, these factors increased women's vulnerability to economic shocks. Syrian and Lebanese men and women have suffered from skyrocketing unemployment, but the economic crisis has left more women of both nationalities unemployed. So Lebanese women's unemployment has doubled from 17% in 2018 to 33% in 2022, while Syrian women's unemployment has remained high at around 40%. The crisis drove Syrian women into low-paying jobs and often exploitative working conditions. The crisis has also increased women's care responsibilities, and this is a global trend that we see. Another important thing I want to shed light on relates to gender-based violence. Reports by UN Women and different local organizations indicate that the economic collapse reduced access to social services and have heightened basically household stress and have created conditions that contribute to rising GBV incidents. Some communities have seen increases of up to 30%. For refugee populations, particularly Syrian refugees, these challenges are even more acute. In addition, we can say that the crisis has severely disrupted case management, including legal support and shelters and healthcare services. And I think the final thing that I want to talk about, just to highlight how severe it was in the case of Lebanon, because it has impacted both local government actors, for example, like the social development centers, and also it has impacted civil society organizations, which would represent major service providers of key services such as legal aid, psychosocial support, shelters, and case management for gender-based violence survivors and child protection cases. Similarly, social development centers have faced also severe resource constraints and staffing challenges. And all of these inequalities I mentioned have now intensified exponentially due to the war. The war resulted in massive displacement and increased needs for shelter, for protection, for food, for health services, and for assistance. And finally, these societal changes as a result of the war, they threaten to basically further impact women and girls, deprioritize their life and health, exclude them from access to life-saving assistance and decision-making, and limit their mobility and further expose them to violence and threats.
Rachel, I guess just to build on that response, can you talk a bit further about some of the other ways these kinds of crises make people, especially women, children, and I guess others particularly vulnerable, and the consequences of that for those groups?
So Rima did a fantastic job of covering the economic dimensions, particularly in terms of labour and the gender inequalities really in accessing labour markets and formal sector jobs. But I guess the other part of thinking about protracted and complex crises is when we think of conflict, severe conflict, the disruptions are massive. If you think about active conflict, thinking about, say, Yemen or Syria, places where you have actual destruction to infrastructure, complete devastation of institutions, public services, all shot, health services, schools close, massive disruption to lives and livelihoods, possibilities for income, just the collapse, not just of social provision, but all provision. And it has an impact on everybody, but it particularly has a sort of gendered impact on marginalized groups, older people, women, children. I did some research in the Amhara region of Ethiopia when the Tigray conflict spilled over into that region. And we asked people about their coping strategies and what they did in response to the conflict. And you see that depending on how severe the conflict was, we talk about the reversibility or irreversibility of coping strategies. So you might have to reduce your consumption for a little while, but the next day you can increase it. But actually, when things get really bad and protracted, you might have to send your children away. You might have to migrate. You might have to engage in prostitution. You might have to do things that are actually very difficult to reverse. So that actually has a huge impact on societal family structure. And often women bear the brunt of that, and children in particular. And I think, like Rima said, the exposure to gender-based violence is obviously very gendered, particularly strong for women and girls. But I think it's also important to note that you have gender inequality in terms of the impacts of conflict on men and boys too. And often you have norms that are driven by really toxic notions of masculinity. And in conflict setting, boys and men are much more likely to be targeted in terms of physical death or psychological trauma, or just trying to get them engaged in the war. So, we need to think about those dynamics between boys and girls, men and women as well.
And the legacy that leaves for subsequent generations, even after peace has been reestablished. Rima, as a researcher and an advisor, you've looked at various sort of facets of Lebanon's social protection system, as well as multi-purpose humanitarian cash assistance for Syrian refugees. What do we know about the impact of programs like these to address vulnerabilities, like the ones we've been talking about?
So I'm going to start with the oldest piece of research that I worked on. Along the lines between 2018 and 2020, we conducted a study to basically measure the impact of multi-purpose cash assistance on Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And this was assistance that is being distributed by WFP and UNHCR. So this impact was studied over the short term, the long term, and the results show that basically the impact materialized across most dimensions of well-being in the long run, indicating really the importance of households' access to longer durations of assistance. We can see that multipurpose cash assistance has led to a sizable and significant increase in total monthly household expenditure and a significant decrease in food insecurity of households receiving long-term assistance. Also, the results when it comes to the education dimension, short-term assistance had significant positive impacts on formal education, which was sustained also in the long term for both boys and girls. In terms of healthcare, basically the results found a significant positive impact of long-term on accessibility to healthcare services, specifically primary healthcare services, but also long-term access to social assistance almost tripled the number of respondents who reported having good mental health, and this is very important. Now, to move to the National Poverty Targeting Program, so between 2022 and 2024, UN Women and WFP worked on really pushing forward on mainstreaming gender and social inclusion within the National Poverty Targeting Program. And at the time, this program was Lebanon's largest poverty-targeted social safety net program. The MPTP has been phased out, and households have been reclassified and integrated now into what we call the Emergency Social Safety Net program. So in 2022, we conducted just gender and social inclusion analysis of the MPTP, and we found positive results. We found that women were highly satisfied with the newly dollarized cash assistance at the time. It was flexible, it gave them control, but we saw that women were actually taking active roles in applying for the assistance and managing the cash assistance they're receiving. We also found that women cash recipients reported that this assistance has allowed them to ease family tensions because it provided them with the security of a monthly income. However, I want to point out that while the analysis shows positive findings in terms of women's agency and autonomy, the analysis also showed that recipient households, especially women, are still resorting to negative coping strategies because of the exponential increase in food prices. And actually, these findings were confirmed by another study that we did. So in a more recent study, not published yet, but we did this in 2024, we assessed the food, nutrition, and health needs of vulnerable groups of MPTP recipients. And these are women and girls of reproductive age, older women, women heads of households, and persons with disability. And the results show that despite the assistance that they're receiving, food insecurity remains prevalent. The report also highlights that many face financial and logistical barriers to accessing healthcare. And here we go back to how the crisis caused a disruption in essential services, for example, subsidized essential services that used to be offered at local social development centers. So women still face challenges when it comes to their menstrual health, and they often resort to unsafe alternatives. So basically, the bottom line here, Joe, is that cash assistance has had positive impacts, but also the results show that cash assistance alone is not enough to overcome these gendered inequalities.
Thank you. And Rima, tell me a bit more about what work you think needs to be done in order to make these kinds of programs more gender sensitive and more responsive to those needs.
So recently, I've been working with an amazing team of researchers. And here I'd like to send a shout out to Maria Clara Cos, Sarah Cookson, and Lily Bremen. We've been developing this detailed training program on gender responsive social protection. And if I consider the messages that we are trying to get out there to policymakers and to key stakeholders, I would say that so much work still needs to be done at the program level. And I think this includes first and foremost, really fostering commitment among key stakeholders. So raising awareness among policymakers, social protection specialists, and implementers, specifically in Lebanon, on the linkages between gender and social protection programming, showing that social protection objectives of any program or policy are inherently gendered, and the majority of these goals cannot be achieved effectively without integrating gender considerations, and really explaining how social protection can address key gender thematic issues. And I can say that in Lebanon, we're still at the beginning stages. Then, after getting this buy-in, I think gender should be integrated, as I said, at every stage of the program: design, delivery, monitoring, and evaluation. So even when you look at things like gender analysis, which are essential, and at the interface level, delivery systems are not just about beneficiaries. And this is a very important point because they also involve the workers who deliver the services. And these workers, who are often women, play a critical role in shaping access to and the experience of social protection. These workers hold significant discretionary power in interpreting and implementing policies, often in gendered ways. So it's very important that there is proper capacity building for frontline workers so that the decisions they make, they're not based on harmful cultural norms or personal biases.
Rachel, evidently social protection systems are important in addressing vulnerability in crisis, even if, of course, as Rima's outlined, they're not enough necessarily on their own. What are some of the lessons about how to maintain and sustain existing programs or systems amid wide-scale crisis, state collapse, displacement, and all of the things we've been discussing?
That's a big question, and it's something that we've been working on quite a lot in basic research program funded by FCDO. First of all, I guess I'd say to sustain or maintain anything, it's really important to have policy commitments. So just going to the bigger, higher level, global, national commitments. And we've seen global commitments to increase the use of social protection instruments in these protracted crisis settings are being made on both the humanitarian side and on the development side. We've seen the Grand Bargain, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, localization agendas. And then on the development side, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals, we've got the Social Protection for All. So it's really critical to have all that buy-in, to have any kind of sense that we're going to sustain anything when we've got these huge protracted crises. But I think more fundamentally, when you get down to sort of the programmatic level, there's two sort of distinct foci to thinking about sustaining. Ultimately, we're interested in sustaining support to the most vulnerable during a crisis, right? That's what we're interested in. But of course, that might mean sustaining a system, but sometimes that system is damaged. We talked before. Sometimes it's not fully functioning. And that might mean thinking innovatively around multiple combinations of actors that can provide support during a crisis. So it might be that the national system can function. It might be, maybe in Kenya or somewhere where they've got a really stable system and you have a small crisis and the system is able to sustain itself, or we can put in place things to sustain the system. But in other places where you might have had a system, it's become damaged, and all of a sudden humanitarian needs to substitute for the state. That's one of the functions of humanitarian support. And in those cases, we need to think carefully about that coordination and nexus between humanitarian and social protection, and what functions within the whole social protection delivery chain can we sustain, and which do we have to allow other actors to substitute or complement during that period. Again, going back to the Ethiopia example, when the Tigray conflict happened, there was a lot of damage to infrastructure. And even though the national system was functioning, it was not able to deliver. And even international organizations, just because of security reasons, they were not able to deliver the safety net provision in certain areas. So there were different mechanisms for sustaining support. One of them was to think about how do we work with third-party implementers, right? So instead of big international organizations or the government doing it, think, okay, who's on the ground? What local organizations can deliver for us? Or maybe it's a big NGO, Food for the Hungry. You allow them flexibility in their funding pots so they can sort of quickly move funds from, say, long-term development to more humanitarian or quick, rapid response. You might have to say, well, you know what, our targeting that's based on proxy means test, we can't use that. We need to go for a good enough targeting. We need to change things up a bit. Also, there was a traffic light system developed within different districts, and there was some monitoring around when can the safety net function again. So there's some really interesting examples. I mean, the other thing a colleague of mine, Rachel Slater, is working on quite a bit is thinking about something that Remo was referring to, not just the hardware about how can the system be sustained, but the software. What about the frontline workers? What about social workers? Sometimes, obviously, sadly, people are killed in conflicts. Other times they're not. They keep working. Things don't all just stop happening. People are working. People need support because often when the crisis is over, things can get back to normal. But we need to think really cleverly about how we work with civil society organizations, how we work with sort of the unusual suspects in development, and how that's going to help us manage and sustain delivery and sustain people's lives during these messy crises. One other thing I'll say is this complementarity between humanitarian aid and social protection is actually critical in order to maintain and sustain systems during crisis. These are all huge agendas.
Rima, I understand that there had been some interest from the government of Lebanon in building a more comprehensive social protection system. But what are some of the challenges to actually realising that ambition, given all of these interlinked crises and pressures that we've been discussing?
Going back to what Rachel said at the beginning of the podcast, how social protection has been on the rise, specifically after COVID. So the government of Lebanon has launched the National Social Protection Strategy in late 2023. And this really marks a significant milestone in Lebanon's ongoing recovery efforts, and it's a step forward towards comprehensive social reform. We also have seen in the last period new social insurance schemes such as the National Disability Allowance, which has been ongoing. But there are definitely several constraints and challenges, and specifically when it comes to the impact of the crisis on the functionings and on the potential in relation to social protection. So one of the main challenges that we see relates to the increased vulnerability and expanded needs. So crisis in Lebanon, and similar to the different parts of the world, they actually exacerbate socio-economic vulnerabilities. They create new vulnerabilities. This surge can overwhelm existing social protection mechanisms, making it necessary to frequently recalibrate targeting criteria, specifically when it comes to programs that rely on proxy means testing for identifying vulnerable people. And it forces the government and the different stakeholders to recalibrate service delivery models. And this is something that also Rachel touched upon when in times of crisis and the recent war in Lebanon, service providers were not able to reach areas that were heavily targeted, and this is a major constraint. Also, the problem with the Lebanese social protection framework relates to the economic crisis, and these are basically fiscal constraints and donor dependence. So a significant challenge in the country's ongoing fiscal crisis and political instability is basically limited domestic funding. Consequently, they rely heavily on donor support and international partnerships. We can also see that the economic crisis has caused basically specialized staff leaving key government departments. So there's a lack in capacities at the levels of the ministries.
It is a good example of how, I guess, crisis can drive change, although, of course, you've outlined some pretty significant constraints there as well. So, Rachel, coming back to you, we talked a moment ago about how you maintain systems where they do exist. What are some of the lessons for how you might try to build or extend systems in the way that Rima's just described?
Yeah, I think where you've got a system that's either shattered or very much weakened, and you really don't have a social protection system at all to build on, or it's gone. Think of places like Sudan or Yemen. The usual provider is humanitarian assistance of some kind, or sort of local level providers, maybe religious providers. And the best thing you can do, I think, is to think about how you can use or facilitate humanitarian interventions that they strategically set up or grow what might be a future social protection system. So, for example, we know in lots of places humanitarians might be working, and often very fragmented in terms of who's working on the ground at any one point in crisis situations. But setting up, say, registration systems or collection of data that might be able to be centralized. It might not, because it might be sensitive around refugees. But if not, why not think about ways that you can centralize that data so that if and when the government is ready to restart its social protection system or to build a social protection system, it already has a basis for targeting, and it can set up sort of registration systems.
And finally, perhaps just coming to that point about thinking into the future, and we have touched a few times in this episode on hopefully what happens post-crisis, or once crisis is abating, or, once peace has been achieved. Obviously, peace building and post-conflict reconstruction is a whole different area again. But I guess there is that old saw about never wasting a good crisis. And it is interesting to consider that there might be opportunities to reshape systems, but also coming back to the themes around gender that we've been discussing, some of the social norms and women's empowerment that can emerge through post-conflict reconstruction. Interested to hear from you.
Good question. It's not something that I worked explicitly on, but it's definitely an interesting question, because uncertainty, certainly, it does present opportunities. I mean, crises are terrible, but there are opportunities that are presented in the fact that there's so much change happening simultaneously across economic spheres, political spheres, social spheres. People are changing the way they do things. And perhaps, particularly in terms of gender, it's a good space to think, okay, let's build back in a different way when we're going to reconstruct or have a post-conflict situation. Concretely, some of the work I've done again in Ethiopia during the conflict, there were times when women would be doing much more moving out of the house to go to market because men were being targeted, and they were in different spheres. They wouldn't necessarily have been going there. And they were vulnerable to various types of exploitation, but it meant they were able to go into different spheres because of that dynamic change. And maybe after the conflict ends, we can think about, what does that now mean for how social norms have changed? How do we, particularly in terms of gender, women usually play a really important role in conflict prevention and resolution. How do we engage women as leaders to promote peace and stability? I think there's very likely areas of innovation around digital technology, new technologies and modalities and platforms that maybe humanitarians bring, because in terms of delivering of cash, maybe we can learn from that within a development framework, social protection longer term. Maybe there's ways of integrating women more safely into different programs. I think the other thing to remember is when you're in an acute humanitarian sort of crisis, social provisioning is around protecting people's lives at that point. Whereas as you move into a more of a stable context, development, looking back, building back, you're moving more into livelihoods as well. So it's how you build, say, productive inclusion programs or cash plus programs in a gender sensitive way.
Yeah, this is more in that women, peace and security space. But some of the other ways that post-conflict periods create at least opportunities to address norms include, for example, the fact that post-conflict periods sometimes involve constitutional or democratic reforms, creating new governance and democratic structures, which might create space and seats for women in decision-making bodies. I think Nepal is held up as an example of this. Where men unfortunately have been killed through conflict, women can assume new roles in the workforce, and that can have transformative effects. European history also provides a really salient example of this. But of course, none of this can be taken for granted. Rachel, Rima, thank you so much for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you so much, Jo, for having me on fp.org.
Thank you so much for having me, Jo. And Rachel, it was a pleasure being in this podcast with you.
Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Bumba Chitiaba, who is a human rights governance specialist and the lead consultant of a recent publication, Roadmap for the Use of Social Protection to Tackle Child Marriage in Zambia. Welcome, Bumba.
Thank you, Jo, for inviting me to this podcast.
Thank you. One of the many gendered aspects of crisis and displacement that we were talking about is that girls can be of higher risk of early marriage as a response to insecurity, poverty, lack of educational opportunities, and so on. And we wanted to take this opportunity to talk more about the role of social protection to tackle child marriage more broadly. Zambia is a country that has made some real progress to reduce the rates of child marriage, I understand, from 42% in 2007 down to 16.5% of girls aged between 15 and 19 who are married now. But of course, that's still high, especially compared with the less than 1% of boys who are married in that same age group. So I wanted to ask you first, what are some of the reasons or the factors that girls do marry young in Zambia?
Looking at the statistics, yes, for sure, despite the number going down, child marriage is still a challenge in Zambia. And you may wish to note that child marriage is a complex issue, which mostly is influenced by multiple factors. And some of the critical factors, for example, poverty, gender inequality, the influence of cultural norms, and also just the aspect of lack of education. The causes of child marriage could be based on specific sociological realities of different regions within the country. And these realities are influenced or are tied to cultural, economic, and in some cases, social contexts. So it is important for us, again, to mention that some of the causes could also be tied to the legal frameworks where we have multiple and often conflicting legal frameworks. We look at the plurality of laws such as the national, customary, and religious laws relating to child marriage. And probably I also need to mention one issue that is usually less talked about, which is the low and inconsistent rates of birth registration. You realize that there are not many children that are registered at birth in Zambia. So that in itself could and in itself lead to child marriages. So basically, those are some of the issues that I would highlight.
Thank you. So the report you mentioned is called a roadmap, and part of it is describing the range of social programs operating in Zambia that are relevant to children, social protection, and some of these issues. I note that the social cash program, which is a cash transfer program, has been shown to help delay the age of marriage, as one example. But one of the recommendations that I wanted to highlight that I was interested to speak to you more about was that any social protection program, regardless of whether children are the intended recipients, can and should respond to children's vulnerabilities. So could you explain that a little bit more? How do you think more social protection programs could become more child sensitive?
I would like us to firstly understand what we were looking at when we looked at child-sensitive social protection. So here we're looking at some of these government programs and initiatives specifically designed to address the needs of children, especially those from vulnerable households. So in Zambia, this is often achieved through interventions such as social cash transfers, access to health care and education. The idea basically is for us to mitigate child poverty and improve their overall well-being. But it is worth noting that this approach also takes into account the unique vulnerabilities of children, and therefore it aims to maximize benefits for them within the broader social protection schemes. Because you will note that there are other social protection programs that the government of Zambia and other partners are implementing. So the child-sensitive social protection is actually embedded in the already existing social protection programs, which basically means in this case that when we're making social protection programs more child-sensitive, may require designing policies that address the specific needs, rights, and vulnerabilities of children. And in the country, some of the examples that are being implemented to achieve child-sensitive social protection is ensuring direct benefits to children. This could be social cash transfer or educational support. We are also looking at situations where we are prioritizing the most vulnerable children and also strengthening the access to essential services. So in short, we are bringing all these aspects together, but also not forgetting the aspect of strengthening child protection systems.
Your paper also outlines this range of actions Zambia can take to strengthen its social protection system to help address child marriage. It actually sets out a 5-year roadmap that looks, at policies, programs, implementation capacity, obviously financing, always really key. And as you've pointed out just now, child marriage is a multifactorial problem and it needs a multi-sector response. So bringing all of that together. We don't have time to go through each of them, so I do recommend listeners seek the paper out for themselves. I'd like to ask you, though, at the most basic level, if you were trying to convince policymakers to invest more in social protection in Zambia and to adopt this roadmap to take it forward, what would be your arguments? Why do you think this is so important?
So, as indicated earlier, some of the challenges that the country is facing in terms of ending child marriage relates to legal frameworks. And legal frameworks point directly to policymakers. Therefore, engaging with policymakers can never be overemphasized. And the starting point is exactly what we just did by building evidence through research. But secondly, it is also important to note that child marriage is a violation of children's rights. And since Zambia is a signatory to many regional, continental, and global human rights treaties, it is worth mentioning that addressing child marriage should be placed as a priority on the agenda. This is because it places a responsibility on the country to fulfill its obligations. But thirdly, it is also important for us to build on the already existing partnerships with other stakeholders. Different stakeholders bring different strengths and opportunities to the table. So through this, we are envisioning a situation where we are engaging with all these different stakeholders to create a bigger voice as it relates to tackling child marriage. Yeah, so I think those are some of the 3 areas that I feel we can leverage on to begin to engage and influence duty bearers and begin to see themselves in the roadmap, because they were also participants or they contributed to the development of the roadmap.
Yeah, it's a great example of a very collaborative process, I understand, that brought all of this together. And I do hope that you're able to achieve some of those quick wins that you mentioned, and of course the longer term outcomes as well. Lumba Chitiaba, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to share insights on what we've done so far.
And thank you for listening to the Social Protection Podcast. This was the first episode of our 3-part series on social protection in conflict and protracted crisis, produced by socialprotection.org in partnership with the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, which has funded the series and provided invaluable support in shaping the episodes and connecting us with guests. Join me for our next episode on localisation, where state capacity to respond and support the most vulnerable people is weakened or non-existent due to conflict, and international organisations struggle to operate, the role of local actors comes to the fore. We are a production of socialprotection.org. You can find all of our episodes on the socialprotection.org website and on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review. Back next month. See you then.